12 days ago, the University of Missouri Chancellor Tim Wolf resigned. The circumstances leading up to Wolf's forced resignation sparked a school-wide protest. Rona Navales, a broadcast journalism student at the University of Mizzou, describes what the scene was like on campus. Rona, can you describe the events leading up to Tim Wolf's resignation?
So it started with a grad student named Jonathan Butler, who started a hunger strike and refused to eat until the UN president Tim Wolf was fired or resigned. So then he went to the football team and told them what they were doing, and the football team pretty much backed him up, starting with mainly the black players, but then Gary Pinkel, who's the coach, announced that the entire football team was behind them and refused to practice or play until Tim Wolf resigned. And he was on a hunger strike for about, I think, 6 days before the football team got involved. I wouldn't say I've been victimized, nor have I witnessed it firsthand, but I definitely heard about it, and people talk about it and they just kind of assume it's something that's just there. But if no one has gotten hurt extremely physically, then it's kind of an issue that's not talked about until recently, of course. It is there, and one of the issues was the student body president, Peyton Head, who was called the N-word. And there were a few incidents. One was also at a homecoming event where I believe students yelled the N-word to a group of black students, and then ever since the protests have been going on, there have been threats towards African American students.
What was the overall tone of the campus throughout these protests?
I live by downtown, which is closer to the journalism school, which is across the campus from the actual campsite. And I had a few friends coming out. The first time I actually just saw it and I just walked by to see what was going on was when they were pretty much finishing up. I think it was their last night. That also relates to your last question about the overall tone, because that week, I think it was almost 2 weeks now, when that happened, you definitely feel the tension. And it doesn't, I think, definitely if I were a black student, I understand why you would live in fear. I wouldn't say I was very fearful of my life. I was more concerned about black friends, black faculty at the time when this was all really heavy and new. I know a lot of people were kind of afraid to say the wrong thing and to ask the wrong questions because they'd be labeled as racist. You see a lot of people who don't agree with it at all, who still feel like they're better than another person by the color of their skin.
Do you think the events that took place at the University of Missouri could have been prevented? And if so, how do you think we can prevent those issues down the road?
Yeah, probably, because you're always going to have students or just people in general who are at a breaking point if they're not seeing solutions or assertiveness when it comes to issues that are important.
So what was it like for you during this time, being a female Filipino student at Mizzou?
I think for me, also not being very active in the protests, it was most confusing when we were getting the threats, because some of the threats, even though they weren't actually executed, thankfully no one really got hurt, but that evening when we got those yik-yak threats saying that most students are safe and that the person who was sending out those messages were targeting and being hateful towards black students. But given that I was with black friends at the time and I shared a status on Facebook saying if any of my friends don't feel safe going to class the next day, like, I don't mind being their escort, because that night a lot of the faculty who were involved in the protests were assigning black students to be accompanied home by white students because they didn't know how serious these threats were. They were thinking that if whoever's sending out these messages, if they're actually going to kill people, they'd less likely kill those who were led or there was a white person in that group. So I think that was like literally the gray area for me, where I wasn't sure if like I would be okay escorting just because I'm not black, but I'm still a minority. But so far I haven't been fearful or concerned about my safety at all. I think I'm more concerned about my friends who are black, who the threats are directly pointed at. Okay, so now I'm going to read you my friend Miles' response on Facebook. And he said, this is Miles Peters. He is an African-American student. So he says, racism at Mizzou isn't blatantly obvious, which I think is one of the most important things to note when looking into the events that have taken place here. What is being fought aren't acts, though those happen plenty also, but microaggressions, stereotypes, and the ideology that everyone is on the same playing field. Students of the majority have a tendency to look past what it must be like to be part of a population that make 7% of the student population. As you and I both know, racial slurs are one thing, but being the only minority in a 200 student lecture hall is something not everyone can just deal with. What I just read before, there are plenty of ignorant acts to go around, but personally I just tune them out. Microaggressions and stereotyping are definitely a daily issue, which I agree. That's why some people who are objective in all these protests going on, they know that it's an issue that's there, but sometimes it's not blatant enough that they think it's not a big enough issue to talk about or to fight for. But it's there, and that's why some people who, again, are objective don't like that the main focus is about blackness and black power, and it's not more about individuals. Miles also says being the only black student in a lecture hall and being expected to feel completely comfortable. Students of the majority also tend to assume I come from the hood, have a fatherless background, know every rap song, and or are a first-generation college student.
Would you say the protesters have had their demands met, or would you say that there is still an elephant in the room?
I think the elephant in the room would be the list of demands where I say, you know, I've even known black students who don't necessarily agree with all the demands at the time, because not that they're impossible at all, but they would take a little bit more time. It might have not been the best solution just to have high position leaders step down. But I think it's just how they expected the demands, all those demands to be done right away. I think might be the elephant in the room for some people who aren't exactly for the protest, or even people who are in the middle that just want to understand the facts, are more concerned about how were they supposed to get these demands accomplished in a timely manner, understanding all the facts and elements that had to be addressed properly.
Are there any parts you see in this issue that aren't openly talked about but should be?
I guess there were just recent articles about how Jonathan Butler, the grad student who started all this, how he came from a privileged family, but I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think that's part of the issue, is that no matter how hard someone works, how qualified, like whether they're a PhD or not, or whether they're a janitor, they could still face the same type of racism just based on the color of their skin. How it was such a shock because people were saying, like, how has this kid been oppressed? Like, just because he's black, like his dad made millions of dollars last year, and yeah, that's great financially. Like, this is a movement about your socioeconomic stance in society, but it's just you being treated with respect, not just based on credentials, but by who you are as a person, no matter what type of upbringing or socioeconomic background he came from. He's still someone who sees and experiences racism, and that's why he stands for it. So I don't think that's a question. So I'm saying it is an elephant in the room for some people, because they're like, oh, awkward. He's actually like a rich, privileged kid, but he's not, because yes, he's privileged in one sense, but then he's someone who still experiences racism, just like anyone from, you know, quote, the hood would experience racism. So a financial background doesn't justify how much racism someone experiences.
How would you say things were left after the protests?
The focus right now is for black students and just figuring out how to resolve that type of racism and systematic oppression, because I feel like if there's an awareness, it'll also help many other minorities or other minority issues. But right now, the most obvious one is directed towards black students and their needs and demands that can be kind of challenging to direct, which is why a lot of people actually think that the resignation of the president and chancellor was too fast and unfair. And I mean, even black students who aren't active in the protests still think that there wasn't enough reason behind the urgency of two administrative leaders to step down. So I think, I mean, as far as I can see, like, the movement is still active. Right now it's obviously Thanksgiving break, and my friend Miles, the one I quoted earlier, he's out of the country, and I know moving forward, it's something that they're still following up on.
Rona, you had mentioned a list of demands that the protesters had created. Would you mind reading off a few of the demands on the list?
So we demand that the University of Missouri System President Tim Wolf writes a handwritten apology to the concerned Student 1950 demonstrators and holds a press conference in the Mizzou Student Center reading the letter. In the letter, And at the press conference, Tim Wolf must acknowledge his white male privilege, recognize that systems of oppression exist, and provide a verbal commitment to fulfilling concerned student 1950 demands. We want Tim Wolf to admit to his gross negligence, allowing his driver to hit one of the demonstrators, consenting to the physical violence of bystanders, and lastly, refusing to intervene when Columbia Police Department used excessive force with demonstrators. Second demand is we demand the immediate removal of Tim Wolf as UM system president. After his removal, a new amendment to UM system policies must be established to have all future UM system president chancellor positions be selected by a collective of students, staff, and faculty of diverse backgrounds. Number 4, we demand that the University of Missouri creates and enforces comprehensive racial awareness and inclusive curriculum throughout all campus departments and units, mandatory for all students, faculty, staff, and administration. We demand that by the academic year 2017 to 2018, the University of Missouri increases the percentage of Black faculty and staff campus-wide to 10%.